And this is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. Today's guest is Oliver Stover, principal with global business consultant Charles River Associates Energy Practice. He's back to talk about his newest study, the impact of offshore wind in meeting coastal and inland load growth in PJM. It documents the potential value of offshore wind to the biggest U.S. system operator, the PJM interconnection. Oliver began his career in energy as an ExxonMobil equipment engineer and then as a researcher with Vanderbilt University's Risk, Reliability, and Resilience Group. He joined Charles River in June 2023 and in 2025 co authored two detailed papers on the value of offshore wind to the New England and New York power systems. One was called The Contribution of Offshore Wind to Grid Reliability and Resource Adequacy, and the other was Impacts of Offshore Wind on Reliability and Affordability. And we've talked about both of those papers on previous podcasts, and you can find them on the Charles River Associates website. Oliver, in the impact of offshore wind in meeting coastal and inland load growth in PJM, you actually took a step beyond the headlines we're constantly seeing about PJM, and you documented its projected really serious generation shortfalls coming in the near future. And you documented what that shortfall could mean for PJM customers. So I want to ask you to start the podcast off by describing your findings and the implications of your findings. And I want you to describe how much of that shortfall offshore wind can help with. And I want you to talk about whether, because PJM goes all the way from the Atlantic coast all the way inland to as far as I think Illinois. So can it actually meet needs of all those states?
Yeah, great to be with you again, Herman. Really appreciate the question. So in our study, we looked at PJM, which, as you said, is the biggest and oldest and one of the most important electricity markets in the country. Even to set the stage of why PJM matters so much, not just it's big, it hosts a number of critical manufacturing facilities, military facilities, government facilities, DC, and also a lot of people live there. So they really need that power to be reliable, affordable, and a ton of customers have a strong preference for increasingly clean power. As you mentioned, PJM is a grid under pressure. It's got load growth growing due to a number of factors, electrification, EVs, but kind of that top issue that's on everyone's mind is data centers. PJM hosts a number of the most hottest data center markets in the country. So it's, for the first time in many decades, has quite substantial load growth, and it's really looking at, okay, let's add as much generation as it can to keep up with it. Stakeholders across the spectrum are really working hard to meet the moment. You've got utilities working hard, governors working hard, and PJM taking itself, but it's facing real stress. So when we looked at our analysis, we looked at what's in the PJM interconnection queue. And what that means is generators that are waiting in line so that they're very happy to get on that PJM system. And we compared it to just looking at that queue based on historical success rates. How much demand have customers asked for? And we found that PJM is on track for a pretty substantial shortfall, 7.8 gigawatts. That's a big number.
Again?
7.8 gigawatts by 2033. So big number. And we're not the only ones who've highlighted that concern. PJM itself, most recent capacity auction cleared 6 gigawatts short. So our findings are really in line with kind of what we're seeing in the market. In that context, we looked at, is offshore wind an interesting resource that can help? And I think, as you mentioned, people think about offshore wind as a coastal resource, and that's certainly true. It's been a critical part of Dominion's plan. There's a single project that's currently in operations off of Virginia called the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, CVOW, and that Dominion is using that as a way that they're meeting both their clean energy goals and their load goals. But kind of really important to understand is that the way PJM structures its market, anytime you build a new resource anywhere, it helps everybody. So our findings really highlighted that while it's thought of as an offshore wind resource, it coastal resource offshore wind really has an impact to flow across the entire market, with most of the benefits certainly going to the coastal regions, but absolutely spreading across the entire footprint. Something I think you really highlighted though is what are the limits, and we found that that capacity gap that we talked about, 7.8 gigawatts, that's more than offshore wind can do alone. That would be 9 more CVOW sized projects. But in this context, we found that offshore wind can really play a augmentary, not a substitutional role toward closing these gaps.
We should say, Oliver, we really should say that there are a variety of other offshore wind projects that have been proposed or planned or partially built on the Atlantic coast that could interconnect with the PJM system, but they have been put in limbo by various policies that the current administration has introduced, policies and strategies.
Yeah, that's right. There are a number of states that are looking at how offshore wind might play a role in a number of projects. They're in various stages of planning and certainly have faced some permitting headwinds with some of the recent questions being asked by the administration. That's one of the reasons we wanted to look at the study year 2033, so we could give some of those projects, be realistic, give projects time to actually develop and materialize. But we did also were able to kind of leverage some of the information coming out of the most advanced project currently built in partial operation with the CVOW project in Virginia.
Okay. So let me move on to another subject. The paper documents PJM's shift recently away from summer stresses to winter stresses. And those stresses are longer and deeper than summer events, and they can result, because it's the cold of winter, in pretty harsh outcomes. Why is offshore wind an especially valuable resource to help with the winter stresses? For instance, the paper talks about how it might have had a role in addressing events that our listeners are going to remember: Winter Storm Elliott and Winter Storm Fern, and especially talk about again how offshore wind can serve all the PJM customers, even the inland ones.
Yeah, that's a great question, Herman. This is a phenomena we're seeing across much of the eastern U.S. that historically grids that summer, that was the time. That's when we were under pressure. But
Right.
something we've observed is that we've got more demand growing in the winter as folks are using EVs, electrifying their heating, have got more demand. And we're also seeing solar worked. It's been a really effective tool in mitigating some of this summer stress. And then we also had some learnings that during the 2 storms you mentioned, which were real learnings for our industry, that because they can place pressure on fuel systems, we can have higher than expected outages of some of our generators. And that creates this kind of correlated stress event. So even though demand might be higher in the summer, we've got stress in the winter. That's where resources like offshore wind are really interesting as that kind of augmentary role. On the eastern seaboard, they're more likely to blow when it's really cold, which I'm sure we've all experienced before. And that actually can help on the grid, because when you've got those higher speeds in the winter, you can relieve some of the stress. This showed up in our paper, which we were honestly quite surprised to find that because you've got that greater generation in the winter, more than we expected benefits, direct modeling benefits, not just a paper exercise, flowed inland, because we have many of the inland period regions of PJM have more demand in the winter. So areas in Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia, some of them are winter peaking. In those regions, there's kind of a unexpected synergy between offshore wind and those inland regions that we were kind of surprised to find in our paper.
Interesting. And just as the country as a whole is taking more of an interest in electric heat pumps, for instance, for heating, you've got this opportunity to use those winds to power those heat pumps without having to develop other kinds of resources and other kinds of infrastructure, right?
That's exactly right. Heat pumps are a really great example because they actually can have much higher demand, even not just linearly, just very high demand when it becomes very cold. So that's a really important load that we're watching. That's going to have more stress in the winter, and we know that we need to bring those commensurate winter rated resources. So whether that's hardening our fuel systems, looking at longer duration storage resources, or those fuel free winter generation like wind onshore and offshore, that's kind of how we can tackle that winter problem as a whole.
Particularly beneficial because during those winter periods when natural gas becomes something of a constrained resource because you're using it for heating and for generating electricity, now you've got something else that can come in and carry some of that burden. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's been a consistent theme in our across our papers that we've done recently, in regions that have constrained fuel system. Not all of the U.S. certainly, but certain parts, some of these coastal regions in particular. That's where we've kind of done a number of studies that having this fuel-free resource as that kind of relief valve in this sweet spot where we've added winter growth, we've not eased enough of the pressure on the fuel system. There's a really nice synergy there that you end up getting more reliability benefit than you would if you had either resource separately. They bring out the best of each other.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that although it's somewhat tangential to this subject, Oliver, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on it unless you want to, but the technology of electric heat pumps has improved significantly in the past few years, and it can meet even those eastern and midwestern sharp cold spells. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I'm glad you brought up. That's a great point and something that we're watching, and that's a key driver of this winter stress story. And as electricity grid planners, we gotta see where people are using power, and heat pumps, especially cold weather heat pumps, are a huge part of that story because a lot of states either have incentives or residential customers, they like it. And so if they're installing this in their house, we got to keep this in our mind as we plan for the system of the future. So whether it's data centers or heat pumps, I've got it in my mind as I'm planning for what the future grid looks like.
Let me ask you a little bit about economics here. I know that the paper isn't really heavy on every aspect of the economic implications of offshore wind, but what are the economic implications of the growing PJM capacity market costs that have increased customer bills so much in recent years? And again, um, in terms of the capacity needs of the system, can offshore wind benefit inland PJM customers as well?
Yeah, that's right. We looked at a few aspects of the economics. We weren't necessarily saying that offshore wind, comparing that this A or B is cheaper. When we were looking at just the amount of stress that we were seeing on the grid, it really we weren't seeing this as a substitutive resource, something that can augment. So that's kind of the lens we were looking through. So you're exactly right. We weren't looking for the least cost resource mix, but what we did find is that currently the way that the PJM grid operates is that if the amount of generating supply we have gets close to the amount of demand we have, prices go up. And as you mentioned, that's creating price pressures for this critical region. So in that context, every new megawatt of energy generation helps to ease those pressures. Offshore wind has that potential. It especially right now is has a relatively high accreditation, competitive with even some non-dual fuel thermal resource, which I think would surprise people. That will go down. That's important to know that will go down over time, but that doesn't mean it's zero. It's still a resource that can help ease that pressure, close that gap, and help bring those prices down. Another aspect, though, to keep in mind is that electricity grid outages in and of themselves have economic implications. So that's something we looked at, and the amount of reductions we're talking about is substantial in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars that it can help to either augment economic development by helping create new jobs or reduce those reliability risks. And that's all resources, and offshore wind is certainly a part of it. And as we mentioned, it's not a paper tiger. Because we're adding resources, those resources don't just stay on the coast. Our analysis found that the reliability benefits were highest in Virginia. Certainly, this makes sense. It's directly connected to Virginia. that makes sense. But because it's helping ease some of those local pressures in Virginia, it actually helps spread across the country and reduce reliability risks of outages across the entire footprint, including in inland states.
And one of the criticisms of offshore wind that some people have made is its cost. But when you're talking about meeting these reliability needs, meeting these winter stresses, it makes it a little bit, I would think, a little bit more economically competitive. I'm not sure if you did any work to verify that, but do you have an opinion on that?
We in our previous work we've looked at those cost concerns, and it's a valid concern. Affordability is kind of has to be at the core of what we're doing as reliability grid planners, and this is a real pressure for people. In our previous study, we had looked at kind of on paper this popular metric used to evaluate offshore wind levelized cost of energy, and it's higher, and I think that gets a lot of people's attention. What we found though is that if used carefully and in a context, offshore wind can be cost competitive if you actually look at the reliability and energy properties it brings, particularly its ability to interconnect with these really constrained, stressed zones like New York City, Boston, coastal Virginia. What we didn't include in that analysis was some of the costs that might be associated with the transmission upgrades on the offshore wind side, or with some of the pipeline upgrades that might have to be associated with a natural gas alternative. We'd love to go there. I think it's an unanswered question. I think that's the only way that we really can have a fair comparison of the cost. That being said, what you hit is right. If we're short, we're short. And a little bit, not entirely, but a little bit, cost becomes less of a concern because at that point, we just got to keep up. And I think that's another factor of, is this more about using all of the above resources and certainly finding ways to bring prices down for all our technologies on learning rates? And that's something on my mind as well.
Exactly. Okay. One more question, Oliver. We've talked a while. I want to get wonky just for a minute. Um, in your past papers, you've talked about resource planning and modeling. I'm wondering if there are aspects of the resource planning and modeling in PJM that could lead planners and stakeholders to different conclusions about offshore wind than the assumptions that they're now using. For instance, what cost do PJM customers face if they don't have offshore wind? That's something that maybe planners and stakeholders could think more about. But what ways can resource planning and modeling take a fair look at offshore wind, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
No, yeah, it's a great question. I think we have to ask in both directions. When would this resource make sense and stop making sense, as we should for all our resources? I think the first top line is going to be load growth. This is a real question that's being asked of PJM and all others. That the data center phenomena is tough, and we got to kind of understand what's going on there. I think that the second factor, as a part of that, are what are the economic, strategic, national security implications of not meeting that load growth? So if we have to slow that load growth, does it harm our country? That's an interesting and different way of thinking about resource planning that might change how we make decisions about offshore wind, but about all technologies. If these are really strategic, national security, critical underpinners of economic development, as many of these projects are, not just data centers, but we've talked about we identified new auto manufacturing, new battery manufacturers, a bunch of economic development that's going on in the PJM footprint. If we can't keep up with demand, that could have serious economic implications. That's on my mind. That's a new way of thinking about electricity grids. But
we're also trying to onshore new transformer manufacturing and new grid component manufacturing so that we can deliver electricity. So it's a double whammy if we don't, and a double bonus if we do. But I don't know if do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, certainly that was a part of our analysis, that we looked at the types of loads that are growing in PJM, and data centers are certainly getting attention, but they're not the only one, but not by a long shot. As you mentioned, there's a kind of prestige investment in new semiconductor chips that's happening in Ohio with the Intel plant. It's really made billions of dollars in local growth there, in jobs and economic development and national security implications. All of that works if we have reliable, affordable, clean power. And
Exactly.
I know that might not always connect, I think, with the implications of offshore wind, but for us, and what we found is that it's offshore wind is just another tool in the tool belt, and we have to think about the level, the balance, the degree of investment. But kind of our finding is that it does have the ability to support some of that economic growth, and that's where policymakers can start to make that nuanced decision of, is this the right resource? How do we balance an investment? Importantly, our paper found that offshore wind, like I said, it is an effective tool across the footprint, but it's certainly not going to be enough. We broadly found that we'll require, like I said, a balanced investment across the footprint to kind of meet the degree of load growth that we're seeing in PJM.
Great guidance, Oliver. Thank you so much. I think that's a good place to leave it. I want to thank you. My guest has been Oliver Stover, principal with the energy practice for global business consultant Charles River Associates, and he's discussed U.S. Atlantic coast offshore wind projects' potential to alleviate some of the cost and reliability urgency facing the PJM interconnection, the biggest U.S. system operator. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown, and as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.